So I think it's fairly self-evident that we all have many hopes and aspirations for our own children and for children generally. And these tend to be underpinned by the necessity for the children to be healthy for these aspirations. It's no good worrying about education if they're going to die or be sick. And in the developed world, I think we mostly assume that our children will be healthy. But unfortunately, in much of the undeveloped or less developed world, this isn't the case. Still, 25% of death comes from infectious disease. And I find this appalling when we've had strategies for dealing with infectious disease that really are quite tractable in much of the world. But how can we roll these out for everyone else? And I think the answer from history tells us that what we need to do is have vaccines and have greater and appropriate access of vaccines for these people. Polio has been a huge success story. We've largely eradicated polio, and the small amount of polio that remains causes significantly less harm. But there's still many other diseases out there for which we don't have vaccines or for which we can't get vaccines to the right communities. Vaccines also tell us the power of the individual and the idea of an individual. The idea of vaccination really is the idea of one man, the idea of Edward Jenner, who noticed that his cowmaids didn't get smallpox and wondered whether he could use this. So I think we should be emboldened by the fact that someone's idea can save 500 million lives to date, it's calculated. But what do we need to do? I mean, the issues fall into two camps, really. We have diseases for which the strategies that we use to generate current vaccines just won't work. Pneumonia kills 1 million a year, meningitis kills 1 million a year, TB still kills 1 million a year, malaria kills 1 million a year. And for all of these diseases, our current strategies are just not sufficient. We need new vaccines. And to get those new vaccines, we need to do new science to understand and come up with new ideas. The other issue is that our current vaccines generally need to be delivered in very bulky, chilled packages. And this limits where we can deliver them to. The other issue is that new vaccines, as they come along, tend to be even bulkier and require even more difficulties in transport. So the World Health Organization have calculated that if we add 2 more vaccines to our standard childhood package, we increase the amount of transport we need tenfold. And this has huge implications for who we can get those vaccines to. What do we need to do about this? We think that what we need to do is start to think across many different levels. This isn't just a science problem, this isn't a medicine problem. This is engineering, this is economics, this is policy, this is government, this is transport infrastructure. Thinking at the level of science is actually perhaps where we start from and are happiest. This is something that I'm showing from our own work on meningitis, where trying to understand the basic biology of how meningitis bacteria live within us has led to an idea for a new vaccine that we're now developing with Novartis. And this is looking very hopeful to provide protection against bacterial strains we've never had protection. Similarly, for HIV, we hope that by understanding the biology of the pathogen better, we can come up with completely novel approaches. One thing that in Oxford we're particularly interested in doing is using mathematical modelling to better understand how a pathogen lives and changes throughout its life with the host. And this is particularly important in the case of influenza, where although we have vaccines that are very good if given once a year for particular strains, we have no global protection. This is actually something which describes how influenza changes in response to the host's immune system. And by using this sort of modelling, we think we are grasping at little ankles, Achilles' heels for the virus, where we can go and potentially design influenza vaccines, which would give some level of protection against many strains of influenza, rather than very detailed protection against one. So we think that this approach, basic science to understand the biology, can drive us into new ways of looking at vaccines. But as I say, that's only part of the story. The other issue we're looking at is, can we get around this issue of the cold chain required to deliver the vaccines? And one thing that we need to do there is to try and find ways to protect vaccines if we store them under more normal conditions. So one thing we've been looking at in Oxford is trying to understand whether we can use technologies that are based on plants, which can be completely dried out and then be resuscitated when they see water. And you'll see one of these in the next slide. I'm clearly gabbling. So these are wonderful plants. You can dry them out completely, and then the minute water comes along, they'll come back to life again and live. And the reason they can do this is essentially they have the equivalent of an antifreeze, sugar, in the plant, which protects them from the damage caused by being dried out. And our team have realised that they can use these sugars to protect the vaccine components. And in fact, they can then dry vaccines down onto little sheets of filter paper, which are much simpler to transport. They don't need to be chilled. They're much less bulky than a package containing a vial. This can be taken out to the site where it actually needs to be given to people and reconstituted using only simple sterile water injected through this syringe and through this device. So we're hopeful that approaches like this might mean that we can really get vaccines to the places they need to be got. You know, last century saw the eradication of smallpox. We actually think, by comparison to many ideas that people have, vaccines to the right people is a small idea that could be accomplished on a relatively short timescale. 10 or 20 years should really be able to see us tackle this and do something about it. but it is going to take bringing different communities together.
Oh, good job.